Power does not collapse when it becomes violent. It does not collapse when it becomes arbitrary. It collapses when it loses the structures that explain why it exists. Empires are often remembered through the personalities of their rulers, through excess, scandal, cruelty, or spectacle. Yet this focus on character obscures a deeper truth. Political systems rarely break because of individual failure alone. They break when authority detaches from the mechanisms that once justified it. In ancient Rome, imperial power was never absolute in theory. It was negotiated, balanced between military loyalty, senatorial recognition, and public acceptance. The emperor ruled not simply by command, but by managing perception, tradition, and restraint. Authority had to appear legitimate, even when it was not democratic. This balance was fragile from the beginning. The Roman Empire had no formal system of succession, no constitutional guarantee that power would pass smoothly from one ruler to the next. Each transition depended on consensus among elites, armies, and institutions that retained the ability to withdraw support. Imperial authority survived only as long as it could present itself as necessary, stabilizing, and predictable. For this reason, the emperor's most important role was not domination, but containment. Containment of fear, containment of ambition, containment of personal impulse. When that containment eroded, the system did not merely become cruel, it became incoherent. The death of Nero on June 9, 68 AD, marks one of the clearest moments in Roman history when this incoherence became visible. Not because Nero was uniquely destructive, but because under his rule, the separation between personal desire and institutional authority collapsed. Power stopped pretending to serve the system. It began serving itself. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through the removal of restraints that had once limited imperial behavior. Advisors were sidelined, traditions were ignored. The symbolic distance between ruler and ruled disappeared. Authority became performative, expressed through spectacle, punishment, and visibility rather than administration. What mattered was no longer whether decisions stabilized the empire, but whether they affirmed the emperor's presence. And once power becomes personal, it must constantly reassert itself. It can no longer rely on inherited legitimacy. It must be seen, felt, and feared. Every challenge becomes existential. Every criticism becomes betrayal. In such a system, loyalty is no longer institutional. It is emotional, temporary, and conditional. Rome did not turn against Nero because he violated moral norms. Roman politics had survived cruelty before. It turned against him because the empire could no longer explain why he ruled or what limits still constrained him. The moment an emperor must rely solely on force, performance, or terror to maintain authority, legitimacy has already failed. The death of Nero is therefore not merely the end of a reign. It is the exposure of a structural weakness embedded in the Roman imperial system itself, a weakness that would surface again and again in the centuries that followed. This episode is not about a tyrant. It is about what happens when power outlives its justification. To understand why Nero's fall mattered, we first need to understand the kind of world he stepped into. Because by the time Nero became emperor, Rome was already living with a contradiction it had never fully resolved. The Roman Empire did not begin as an open monarchy. It emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, from the ruins of the Republic. Old institutions remained in place. The Senate still met. Magistrates still carried republican titles. Public language continued to speak of tradition and shared authority. But real power had shifted. The emperor ruled, yet he ruled through structures that still pretended to limit him. This ambiguity was not a mistake. It was deliberate. Rome had learned that power was easier to accept when it did not announce itself too loudly. Under Augustus, this balance worked remarkably well. Augustus avoided calling himself king. He presented his rule as a restoration of order after chaos, not a break with the past. His authority depended on restraint, symbolism, and careful distance. He ruled by shaping expectations, not by overwhelming them. What Augustus proved was not just that Rome could accept an emperor, but that it could accept one as long as power remained controlled and discreet. That success, however, created a problem. It set a standard that required constant self-discipline. Under Tiberius, restraint remained, but warmth disappeared. Tiberius governed from a distance, relying on procedure and suspicion rather than public presence. The system still functioned, but it felt colder. Authority remained intact, yet confidence began to erode. Rome was ruled, but no longer reassured. The relationship between emperor and society was becoming thinner. With Caligula, that relationship snapped into open tension. Caligula treated power as performance. He mocked tradition, crossed boundaries deliberately, and turned authority into spectacle. For a brief moment, Rome saw what imperial power looked like when restraint was abandoned. But Caligula's reign was short. His excesses were explained away as madness. The system survived by blaming the man, not the structure. Remove the emperor, restore order, and move on. That solution worked, temporarily. Under Claudius, Rome regained stability, but in a different way. Claudius ruled not through charisma or symbolism, but through administration. He expanded bureaucracy, relied on legal processes, and delegated authority to officials within the imperial household. Government became more efficient, but also more internal. Power worked, but it worked quietly, and often without public legitimacy. Claudius showed that Rome could function even when its political meaning grew unclear. Across all these reigns, one problem remained unresolved. Rome still had no formal rule of succession, no clear answer to the question of how power should pass from one emperor to the next. Each transition depended on a fragile balance: military loyalty, elite acceptance, and public tolerance. This made imperial authority incredibly strong, but also deeply unstable. By the time Nero inherited the throne, the role of emperor was already confused. He was expected to command absolute power, yet behave modestly, to embody Rome, yet remain distant from it, to rule decisively while pretending not to dominate. Such expectations could survive only if the emperor accepted limits. At first, Nero's reign appeared to follow this pattern. Advisors governed, traditions were respected. The familiar structures remained in place. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. The longer Rome lived with imperial power, the more its limits depended on habit rather than enforcement. And habits weaken when they are tested. Rome did not fall into crisis because it lacked laws. It faltered because its system relied on behavior instead of obligation. The emperor could cross boundaries without immediate punishment, and each time he did, those boundaries moved. Gradually, the nature of authority itself began to change. Power became more visible, more personal, more expressive. The emperor was no longer simply the guardian of order. He became the center of attention. This was not yet tyranny in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter, a system losing clarity about itself. Nero did not create this instability. He inherited it at the moment when it could no longer be ignored. When Nero became emperor, nothing about his position required immediate rupture. The imperial system was already familiar with young rulers, guided reigns, and delegated authority. At first, Nero's rule appeared to follow a recognizable pattern. Power existed, but it was mediated. In the early years, real authority flowed through advisors and institutions rather than the emperor himself. Figures such as Seneca and Sextus Afranius Burrus acted as stabilizing forces. They translated imperial power into policy, procedure, and restraint. Decisions still passed through recognizable channels. The emperor remained present, but not dominant. This phase mattered more than it appears. It showed that the system could still function, but only when someone else supplied the limits Nero himself did not yet enforce. Over time, that mediation weakened. The first shift was not violent, but symbolic. Nero began to treat the imperial role less as a position to inhabit and more as a platform to express himself. Public performance, artistic ambition, and visibility became central to his identity as ruler. The emperor no longer stood above the crowd, he stepped into it. In isolation, this did not threaten the empire. Roman audiences were accustomed to spectacle, but something subtle changed. Authority, once grounded in distance, became grounded in presence. Power was no longer something that worked quietly through institutions. It began to work through attention. At the same time, restraints were removed. Advisors lost influence. Burrus died. Seneca withdrew. The figures who had absorbed pressure between Nero and the system disappeared, and their absence exposed the emperor directly to power's full weight. This was the turning point. Without intermediaries, Nero did not merely govern differently, he governed personally. Decisions increasingly reflected impulse rather than procedure. Punishment became expressive. Favor became unpredictable. Authority ceased to feel stable because it no longer behaved consistently. Then came the fire. The Great Fire of Rome did not need to be Nero's fault to damage his legitimacy. Its significance lay elsewhere. The disaster shattered Rome's sense of continuity. Large portions of the city were destroyed. Displacement followed. Fear followed. And in moments of collective crisis, authority is tested not by intention, but by perception. Nero responded as a ruler accustomed to performance. Reconstruction plans were announced. New visions were unveiled. A grand palace rose where private restraint might once have been expected. For many Romans, this response felt misaligned. It did not matter whether Nero had caused the fire. What mattered was that his reaction placed his image at the center of recovery. Power appeared self-referential at the very moment it was expected to be stabilizing. Legitimacy began to fracture publicly. In the years that followed, dissent took on a different shape. Conspiracies emerged. Opposition was no longer confined to whispered criticism. It moved into action. Each response from the emperor deepened the problem. Executions multiplied. Trust narrowed. Loyalty became enforced rather than assumed. The imperial system had always tolerated cruelty. What it could not tolerate was unpredictability. As fear replaced confidence, Nero relied increasingly on loyalty that was personal rather than institutional. The army mattered less as a structure and more as a tool. The Senate mattered less as a partner and more as a threat. Authority contracted inward. This inward turn accelerated isolation. When revolts broke out in the provinces, the response revealed how far legitimacy had already eroded. Governors no longer framed rebellion as personal betrayal. They framed it as restoration. Their language mattered. They did not claim to overthrow the empire. They claimed to save it. Support for Nero evaporated not in outrage, but in silence. The Senate did not defend him. The Praetorian Guard withdrew its protection. The emperor, who had once been omnipresent, suddenly found himself abandoned by the very structures that had sustained imperial power. This collapse was swift because the foundations had already thinned. Nero fled Rome not as a defeated tyrant, but as an isolated individual. There was no final battle, no public trial, no rally to restore order. Authority did not fall violently. It dissolved. On June 9th, 68 AD, Nero took his own life. His death did not end the crisis. It exposed it. The empire immediately plunged into a year of civil war. Multiple claimants rose. Legitimacy fractured openly. What Nero's reign had weakened, his death made undeniable. The mechanics of his fall reveal something essential. Nero did not lose power because he was cruel, incompetent, or artistically inclined. He lost power because authority under his rule ceased to be understandable. It no longer followed recognizable patterns. It no longer respected inherited limits. It no longer felt anchored to anything beyond the emperor himself. Once that happened, the system could not protect him. What collapsed was not only Nero's authority, but the illusion that imperial power could survive without shared limits. The emperor had become the system's single point of meaning. When that point failed, there was nothing beneath it to absorb the shock or preserve continuity. Nero's actions did not destroy Roman imperial power. They revealed what happened when power became visible, personal, and unrestrained, and how quickly legitimacy could disappear when nothing remained to hold it in place. The fall of Nero did not end a crisis. It revealed how much of Rome's political order had already been hollowed out. What collapsed in 68 AD was not only a ruler, but a set of assumptions that had quietly sustained imperial authority for decades. The idea that power could remain informal yet stable, that restraint could survive without enforcement, that legitimacy could be inherited rather than continually rebuilt. Nero's reign exposed the cost of these assumptions. Once the emperor became the center of attention rather than the quiet anchor of the system, authority itself began to change shape. Power was no longer something that operated through institutions while remaining partially hidden. It became something that needed to be expressed, displayed, and constantly reaffirmed. This shift did not disappear with Nero's death. In the immediate aftermath, Rome entered a period of chaos. The so-called Year of the Four Emperors was not simply a struggle for control, it was a demonstration of what happens when legitimacy has no agreed foundation. Multiple claimants could rise because no principle existed to clearly disqualify them. Military support replaced political recognition. Force replaced consensus. The imperial system survived, but it survived differently. After Nero, emperors could no longer rely on inherited restraint alone. The illusion that power could be both absolute and modest had been broken. Authority now required clearer demonstrations of control. Emperors became more openly military, more visibly dominant, more explicit in their command of loyalty. This was not necessarily because later rulers were more brutal. It was because the system itself now demanded reassurance. Once legitimacy had failed publicly, it could no longer be quietly assumed. Another consequence was the permanent weakening of the Senate. Already marginalized, it emerged from Nero's fall as a body that reacted rather than governed. It could endorse or reject claimants, but it no longer shaped power. Real authority shifted decisively toward armies and commanders who could enforce outcomes. Rome did not abandon its institutions. It emptied them. The emperor also ceased to be a restrained figure within tradition and became a solution to instability. Authority was no longer justified by continuity, but by effectiveness. A ruler who could impose order mattered more than one who could embody Rome's past. This change altered how power behaved. Emperors became less symbolic and more managerial. Legitimacy was measured by results rather than restraint. Stability mattered more than acceptance. Yet this solution carried its own cost. When authority depends primarily on force and performance, it must be maintained constantly. Loyalty becomes conditional. Opposition becomes existential. The system grows more resilient in the short term and more brittle in the long term. Nero's reign did not create this transformation alone, but it accelerated it. It forced Rome to confront what had been ignored, that an empire cannot rely indefinitely on habits, symbols, and unspoken limits. What followed was not the collapse of Rome, but the end of a particular way of ruling it. Imperial power continued. Emperors still reigned. Order returned. But the subtle balance between visibility and restraint was gone. Authority was no longer something Rome pretended not to see. From this point forward, imperial rule would be clearer, harsher, and more openly enforced, not because Rome desired tyranny, but because it no longer trusted ambiguity. That was the lasting consequence of Nero's fall. Not the memory of a failed ruler, but the loss of an illusion that power could govern itself quietly. The collapse of Nero forces a distinction that is often blurred in discussions of power: the difference between authority and legitimacy. Authority is the ability to command. Legitimacy is the reason others accept that command without constant force. Rome had long mastered authority. It commanded armies, extracted taxes, enforced laws, and suppressed rebellion. What Nero's reign exposed was how fragile legitimacy becomes when it is no longer actively maintained. Legitimacy does not depend on moral goodness. Roman history makes this clear. Cruel rulers had survived before. Violent decisions had been tolerated. What legitimacy requires is something quieter: predictability, restraint, and a shared understanding of where power ends. Under the early empire, legitimacy rested on an illusion carefully preserved. The emperor ruled absolutely, yet behaved as though he did not. Institutions continued to function, traditions were respected, power appeared bounded even when it was not. This illusion worked because it limited fear. Fear alone can enforce obedience, but it cannot stabilize a system. A society ruled entirely through fear must constantly prove its strength. Every challenge becomes dangerous. Every hesitation looks like weakness. Nero's reign dismantled this balance. Power no longer hid behind institutions or traditions. It became visible, expressive, and personal. Decisions appeared driven by impulse rather than procedure. Punishment felt symbolic rather than administrative. As a result, legitimacy eroded even where authority remained intact. This reveals a crucial mechanism. When power becomes personal, it also becomes fragile. It depends on the individual's presence, energy, and control. There is no buffer, no system to absorb error, no structure to outlast failure. Once legitimacy collapses, authority must compensate. Force increases. Surveillance tightens. Loyalty is tested rather than assumed. Stability becomes an ongoing performance. This does not make a regime immediately weak. In the short term, it can appear stronger. Dissent is crushed quickly. Decisions are made faster. Opposition retreats. But this strength is deceptive. A system that relies primarily on force cannot tolerate uncertainty. It cannot allow ambiguity. It cannot absorb dissent without interpreting it as threat. Over time, this rigidity creates isolation at the center of power. That isolation was Nero's final condition. When support evaporated, it did not do so dramatically. It simply withdrew. Institutions that had once sustained authority stepped aside. Legitimacy did not transfer. It vanished. Once legitimacy is lost, it cannot be restored through explanation alone. No speech, reform, or display can replace what is dissolved. Power may continue to function, but it does so without consent, relying increasingly on pressure rather than recognition. At that point, authority survives only as long as resistance remains fragmented. This pattern did not end with Nero. It would reappear throughout Roman history and far beyond it. Whenever power loses its limits, it also loses its explanation. When authority can no longer justify itself, it must defend itself endlessly. The lesson of Nero's fall is not that excess leads to collapse. It is that power without restraint cannot remain intelligible. And when power is no longer understood, it cannot be trusted, and eventually, it cannot be sustained. The death of Nero did not answer the questions his reign exposed. It left them unresolved, suspended inside the system that survived him. Rome did not emerge from this crisis with clarity. It emerged with continuity, and that distinction matters. The empire endured, but it did so by changing how power was understood and exercised. Authority became more explicit. Control became more visible. The quiet assumptions that had once softened imperial rule were no longer trusted to hold. What Nero revealed was not simply the danger of excess, but the vulnerability of power that no longer knows where its limits are supposed to be. When restraint exists only as habit, it disappears the moment habit is tested. When legitimacy is assumed rather than maintained, it vanishes without warning. Rome adapted, as large systems often do. It learned to rely less on ambiguity and more on force, less on tradition and more on effectiveness. This adaptation restored order, but it also narrowed the space in which power could operate without resistance. That narrowing is the deeper cost, because a system that must constantly demonstrate its authority cannot afford doubt. It cannot tolerate distance. It cannot leave questions unanswered. Over time, power becomes less flexible, less patient, and more isolated from the society it governs. Nero's reign did not destroy Rome, but it marked the moment when the empire stopped believing that power could govern itself quietly. From that point forward, authority had to be shown, reinforced, and defended. Not because Rome wanted domination, but because it no longer trusted restraint. This is why Nero's death matters beyond his lifetime. It marks a shift in how power relates to those it rules, a shift away from shared understanding and toward enforced stability. History remembers Nero as a symbol of failure, but symbols endure because they reveal something persistent. His fall forces a question that Rome never fully resolved and that no system of power can permanently escape. Not whether authority can survive without limits, but how long it can function before those limits are no longer remembered at all.